Antique Extreme by Matthew Howard Stull 2009. There used to be an antique shop in Pittsburgh called Swanson's. It was located on the riverside of Butler Street in Lawrenceville, not incredibly far from downtown. I used to stop into Swanson's every so often when I happened to be walking through the neighborhood. The place had such a mysterious smell about it, not unlike other antique shops, but somehow the odor was older and more exotic than anything else I had ever experienced. The aromatic vapors seemed to transport me to another time and place, possibly Egypt maybe, I speculated. I was always totally quiet as I crept through the cluttered place. There were many amazing pieces of furniture there, and various lamps and plates, paintings, tapestries, and statues, of various eras and styles. I used to fantasize about buying practically everything in the store and transporting it in a truck to my tiny apartment in East Liberty. But honestly, I recognize the strangeness of this fact. I never dared to purchase anything from Swanson's Antiques. And the reason for this was the fact that Mr. Swanson himself was just about the creepiest, most intimidating man I had ever encountered in my entire life. His tall, somewhat massive round body and gray beard, his pointy-looking teeth and his penetrating eyes all conspired to give me a little chill of apprehension. His eyes especially were exquisitely fearsome, smoky green spheres darting around with inspired intensity. He looked about his workshop area as though he were an extremely hungry bird of prey. Mr. Swanson wore half-moon spectacles, hanging out to the tip of this nose, and his dirty mangled leather apron seemed ancient at least. The shadowy interior of the store and the flickering lamps joined in to give this man a severe aspect. Every time I'd walk in there, he'd be at the back of the store working on some odd old machine. I couldn't tell you what this machine was all about, but sometimes it would start to hum and whir and even throw about a few sparks from time to time. Mr. Swanson would pull levers or hammer some pins into place and the thing would sputter to life for a moment but inevitably wind back down to a quiet state of stillness. Some smoke and fumes then lingered as the wild-looking old man muttered something or other in total disgust. He was so focused on this device and intense in his activity that I could never bring myself to disturb him. So that's why I never even bought anything. On one occasion, Mr. Swanson must have sensed that I was staring at him, because he turned very slowly and deliberately about 60 degrees to his left and glared right at me. For a brief second we made eye contact and I felt a tingling chill run up my spine. I immediately turned away and pretended to be seriously inspecting an ancient-looking typewriter. After about 10 seconds of this contrived inspection, and after I heard Swanson begin filing away at some copper tubing, I bolted as casually as I possibly could out of the shop and then to the other side of Butler Street. Then I just kept walking, fast. Eventually, I calmed down and fully recovered from the terror I felt upon meeting that horrifying gaze of Mr. Swanson. After a few weeks, I even became curious enough to return to that seemingly antique store in Lawrenceville. But this time I was determined to overcome my fear, and break the ice, so to speak, by actually endeavoring to make a real purchase. On a Thursday in late September I walked back to the place with a considerable stack of cash in my tattered leather wallet. I remember that the sky was insanely gray that day, the day I resolved to buy something totally antique from the mysterious Mr. Swanson. It was the kind of gray that seems to spank one's soul with an ice-cold waffle iron. Or a gray that dips one's head into some simmering inky dark bleach. But anyway, I made it back to Swanson's and began to open the door. But to my serious surprise, I found that the door was locked. This was especially peculiar because a sign in the window read "Open" and another sign titled "Hours" indicated that on a day like that day called Thursday by the locals, the place should be open from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., and as it was just about 12:30 p.m., I couldn't understand why the door was locked. Of course, some emergency may have forced the shop owner to close up, or maybe he was out getting lunch or something. But, to say the least, I was very disappointed by this nasty little surprise. I was just about to turn and walk away when a sparkling flickered up the interior of the store, which was otherwise almost completely dark. I immediately sprang over to the door and peered into the window. But by then the flashes had ceased. A tormenting curiosity kept my eyes transfixed on the darkness within, and I remained there waiting, torn between hope and fear that I would see some more bluish sparks inside. And then, another burst of light, and then another. The whole room was dancing with light now, which emanated from the back, where Mr. Swanson was usually working on that strange machine. It seemed as though a fire might break out at any point, but just when this concern crossed my mind, I saw a figure moving around in between the flashing sparks. Maybe it is more accurate to say that I thought I saw a figure that I thought was Mr. Swanson busily tweaking some devices in the back room there. But it was still difficult to perceive many details among the intermittent shadows. And there was now also a fairly thick cloud of smoke mingling through the cluttered stacked and piled up antiques and whatnot. So I couldn't really tell who it was or what was really going on. "Good afternoon, sir," said voice to my left, in a tone that not only startled me. When I turned spasmodically and automatically I saw none other than, you guessed it, Mr. Swanson himself. In less than a second, I was totally internally melted by the revelation that the person inside the store couldn't possibly have been the same one now standing before me. But that second was now a part of history, and common courtesy compelled me to respond to this most cordial but completely chilling introduction. "Good afternoon, sir," I repeated like some sort of drugged parrot. "If you'll excuse me," Mr. Swanson softly stated as he pulled a large keyring out from under his apron. The keys on the ring were quite rusty, really rusty indeed. I stepped out of the man's way and he unlocked and opened the door. A huge gust of wind poured out through the door when it opened. The wind carried that vaguely familiar but totally mysterious odor along with it, but this time, the smell seemed to be about 150 times stronger than on previous occasions. When I breathed in, I was overwhelmed by this haunting sensation of being sent back in time something like 5,000 or so years. And now there could be no denying it. This was some sort of Egyptian fragrance used during the time of the pharaohs. Of this I was absolutely convinced. "Are you shopping today or just smelling?" Swanson asked as he held the door open. As if in a state of hypnosis I entered the building and answer without outward emotion, "Shopping." "Good, then, please take a look around," again Swanson stated in an amused whisper. So I began to look around, but all the while, I was glancing back to the back workshop area to see if I could get a glimpse of another person back there or to see if Mr. Swanson was doing anything extra peculiar. And what should I buy, I wondered. There is the really rough-looking typewriter from about 1900, or the Japanese lantern with the faded red flowers and the faded gray mountains painted on it. How about all of the pocket watches in the glass case? I especially took a liking to the one decorated with the fleur-de-lis. And at $45, it was well within my price range. I couldn't decide, so I walked over to a slightly leaning bookshelf and tried to see through the dust, whether or not there were any excessively interesting titles. Dickens, Sartre, Aeschylus, Hawthorne. Nah, I really wasn't in the mood for any of those, so I kept looking. On the top shelf was one incredibly dusty volume, whose spine I could not even read. I reached up and pulled it down, brushed off the spine and read it, A Beginner's Guide to the Sacred Mummification Techniques of Ancient Egypt by T.W. Pitchforth. How very fascinating, I thought to myself. Then I flipped through some of the pages. I was greeted by the sight of amazing full-color diagrams explaining every esoteric detail of the entire embalming process. There were also photographs of the pyramids of Giza which looked like they must have been taken thousands of years ago. In the back of the quite bulky book was a huge index of appendices containing literally hundreds of incantations, hieroglyphs, prayers and other religious texts used by the ancient priests during their mysterious rituals. Of course, as you can well guess from my description of this book, I decided quite excitedly that I must acquire this book pretty damn immediately. But how much was it gonna cost? I could not find a price anywhere on the thing, which was beginning to feel more and more heavy all the time. I checked the first page, the second page, the whole book basically, but failed to locate any indication of a price. It would be necessary, I concluded, to ask Mr. Swanson. Now he was standing behind the counter right next to one of those antique cash registers. He had never stood there before in my recollection. His apron was very much smudged up with variously smeared dirtiness, and he smelled of rare machinery. But his creamy green eyes were crystal milky clear. I carefully placed the beginner's guide onto the countertop and inquired, "How much does this cost?" "Oh, that old thing?" he answered. "You can just have that, but I want to ask you something first. Have you ever seen anyone purchase anything in here?" "No, never," I replied. "In fact, I've never actually seen anyone else shopping in here before." And I continued with increasing confidence. "Sir, Mr. Swanson, if you don't mind my asking, I've been wondering for a long time what is that scent, that intoxicating and ancient-smelling smell that I smell when I enter your store?" A faint smile appeared on Swanson's lips, and I thought I saw the milky fluid of his eyes begin to churn and swirl to a degree. And I have to admit, this whole situation was beginning to put me into an exceedingly anxious state of mind. Then he spoke. "Why don't I just show you a couple of things? Do you have a few minutes?" I nodded yes and said yes, absolutely. I've been so curious to know more about this place. "Follow me," Swanson gently commanded me, accompanied by a seductive wave of his hand. We walked back to where the machine was resting, but the old man didn't say anything about it. I noticed as we were passing it that it was covered with a mixture of various hieroglyphics. Most of these were Egyptian in style, but others were completely alien to my knowledge. The machine itself seemed to be fashioned out of some kind of dark stone, perhaps obsidian. There wasn't too much time to investigate it, however, as Mr. Swanson lifted up a trapdoor in the floor. A cool gust of air poured from this opening and stirred all the dust that had been accumulating on just about everything. He pulled a rusty lantern down from the wall and lit it with a match. Then he slowly began to descend a very precariously steep ladder into the darkness below. As you can probably imagine, my heart rate had really increased by this point and my curiosity was just terribly piqued. I was nearly trembling with excitement as I followed the old bared man down, and then further down into the cool, breezy darkness below. At length, we reached the bottom of the ladder, maybe a distance of 25 feet from the square-shaped opening above. The lantern's light was wildly flickering and tossing about in random flourishes against the rough-hewn walls of stone inside the corridor. We walked about 30 yards along this corridor until we came to an imposing wooden door. Mr. Swanson took out his cluttered rusty key ring again and inserted a very large skeleton key into a keyhole in the door. But the keyhole was actually the mouth of a skull which was fashioned into the metal plate attached to the door. The eyes of this skull may have been made out of sapphires, it's hard to say. When this door screeched open, there was an even cooler burst of air to greet us. The chill that I felt was quite substantial and it took on epic proportions when I then peered down an unfathomably long and steep staircase into dark oblivion. Mr. Swanson turned to me and slightly raised his left eyebrow, then turned up the flame on the lamp. The first step screeched ominously as he began his descent. The sound of the wind in this downward slanting corridor was ethereal, even haunting to me. But Mr. Swanson's step was steady and confident. After only a few minutes we were approaching the bottom. I could see a soft greenish glow ahead of us. Turning back, I looked up the stairs just to be sure of something. Yes, we were very far underground now. The howling of the wind gave way, at this point, to the unmistakable sound of moving water. This murmur was being generated by a wide river, in fact, something like 50 feet away. Swanson led me forward to an iron gate and again took out his keys. There were only a few bars crossed vertically and horizontally on this gate, with some odd twisted ornaments of iron carefully positioned. Mr. Swanson opened the iron gate. We passed through, then we locked it from the other side. I was too distracted by the river to be too worried about being locked in such a bizarre underground chamber. The river itself seemed to be giving off this green glow. But then I couldn't be sure that the light was emanating from some other part of this huge open underground chamber. I tried to figure out how this river was flowing in relation to the Allegheny, which must be right above us. But actually this subterranean river might be headed in the opposite. I couldn't quite get my bearings, and of course, by this point, I had 1,000 questions squirming around in my brain. But I was too overwhelmed to ask any questions. "Don't worry, your silence and patience will be rewarded when we reach the other side of the river," Swanson stated with his back turned to me. I followed him upstream a little while along a ledge which became increasingly narrow. I could see a small boat before us tied to the cavern wall. Swanson handed the lantern to me silently and then untied the boat. As we got on board and pushed away, I realized that the lantern really wasn't necessary anymore, but I kept holding it up high. Swanson pushed us, using a long wooden pole, along the green glowing river. When I could catch a glimpse of his eyes, I saw how vividly cloudy emerald they were. It seemed as if they might erupt in an explosion of pale green milk. But, of course, I didn't want to stare, so I was also looking around the cavern a lot too. Even as Mr. Swanson was pushing us to the other side of the river, we were being pulled slowly downstream. So by now, we were quite far from the corridor through which we entered the huge chamber. And after a few minutes of this, we were close to the other side of the river. It seemed as though the glowing had diminished when we reached the other side. And the walls were tilting in more and more at the ceiling. The shape of the cavern was becoming increasingly triangular. Then there was an opening in the cavern wall. Mr. Swanson carefully shifted the boat next to the opening and tied it to a post. There was a lantern hanging from this post and its flame was flickering almost imperceptibly blue. I noticed at this point that the green glow I had seen earlier had now almost entirely absent. We climbed out of the boat. Swanson grabbed the other lantern out of my hand and we set off down yet another dark corridor. The sound of the river became more and more distant until after a few minutes I couldn't hear it at all. Unlike all of the other tunnels we'd passed through so far, this one was very low and narrow. I had to duck down a little bit in order to walk through it, and after a while my back began to ache from all the hunching over. But soon enough we came to what seemed like a dead end. It appeared to be a stone wall before us. By this point, however, I quite expected some sort of access point to make itself known. The wall, or indeed door, had been decorated with bizarre symbols and hieroglyphics. Mr. Swanson placed his lantern on the ground and then knelt beside it. He moved his right arm in a circle over his head and then placed his left arm behind his back. Reaching into his pocket, he said very clearly in an enigmatic voice something like, "Bazurfo basam nagi aknam burmalafizafo." As he completed this strange phrase, he took his hand from his pocket and threw some pinkish gray dust at the decorated stone surface, which until a moment later, I believed to be a wall. By the time the dust had settled, the wall was rising up like a garage door. But it was absurdly quiet, except for a very faint suggestion of grinding stones. The giant stone door lifted all the way up and a green mist was all I could see. Mr. Swanson gently gripped my arm above the elbow and guided me into this glowing green haze. Then the huge door closed behind us. Once it was completely closed, the green mist quickly vanished. Now I could see that we were in a huge room. It must be some kind of laboratory, I thought, because there were strange mechanical devices everywhere. On the left side of the room, there was an assortment of glass containers, whose contents included a pair of lungs, some hearts, and more than a few brains. All of these organs were immersed in a amber-colored jelly-like substance. Next to these containers were all kinds of knives, scalpels, hammers, tweezers, scissors, and saws. In short, it looked like the kind of equipment that would be used on some heavy-duty surgical procedures. In the middle of the laboratory there was an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus, resting on a massive stone table. That scent which I had always noticed when entering the antique shop was here stronger than ever. I could see that the smell from above had originated from a large censer which was spewing out big lofty wafts of bluish smoke vapors. and over to the right there were electric buzzes and whirrings. Several machines were humming at different pitches and one was stirring a thick black substance aired in a huge bowl. Occasionally steam would pour out of a vessel or chamber, seemingly at random. The whole scene was just absolutely astonishing. Mr. Swanson walked over to a small table next the big one, where the sarcophagus was resting. "Oh, I'm so incredibly thirsty," he complained. "Let's have a drink." He picked up a pitcher that was on the table and poured from it into 2 glasses. The pitcher and glass were made of crystal and I noticed a lot of condensation had collected on them. Swanson handed one of the glasses to me, simultaneously taking the lantern out of my hand and placing it on the large stone table. I drank deeply the liquid in the glass. It tasted but with a hint of something else, I have no idea what. Swanson drank the entire glass in one gulp, then he refilled his glass and began to speak. T.W. Pitchforth, the author of that book you pulled from the shelf, A Beginner's Guide to the Mummification Techniques of Ancient Egypt, well, he was my mentor, my boss. He taught me everything I know about this business. That machine, up in the store, was his creation, but unfortunately, it's not really working very well lately. In fact, it may be completely shot. I don't know, but I know what you're wondering. Of course, you want to know about the machine, right? Do you see those mummified bodies over there in the corner, under the huge iron scale? Well, that's my doing. I mummify people. But not just anyone. Trust me, I charge quite a lot for my work. It's not all that simple actually to properly remove organs, drain the blood, soak the body, recite the ancient prayers and everything else. You see, I do everything by the book. That is the way T.W. Pitchforth did it and that is the way he taught me. Exactly as it was done 3,000 years ago, so then, what's up with the big machine? Well, I'll tell you. It's actually a replica of one that Pitchforth saw in some secret tomb while he was on one of his expeditions to Egypt back in 26 or 26. There are others who have seen the thing, I'm sure. But T.W. was the only one who has ever tried and succeeded at building his own. No one really knows what sort of power that old embalming machine used, but I'm forced to use regular electricity straight from the grid. Well, I use a coal furnace too, but that kind of goes without saying. Most of the money I make in this business goes towards researching and buying rarer pieces of stone that might get it back to working like it used to when Pitchforth was in his prime. Early on, when I first started working here, he was up to his eyeballs in business. He was doing 3 or 4 mummies a day, with my help of course. We were working about 14 hours a day, to the point of total exhaustion, and well, we started to notice, hold on a second. A clay pot, which was resting on a stove burner, was boiling over. Swanson strode over to it and removed it from the heat. Then he took the lid off and sprinkled some kind of powder into it and returned the lid. He walked back over to me and continued speaking. You know that purified Nile water we were drinking a few minutes ago? It's true. And guess what? The whole underground river is straight from the Nile too. Pitchforth had it shipped here all the way from Egypt in barges coming up the Mississippi, Ohio, and then Allegheny. He had a system of pipes set up to just pump it down here a few thousand gallons at a time. It took him nearly 10 years to get the whole thing filled up. Even now, I still have to order a load from my good friend Azad Al-Fad. He lives in Cairo now, and thank God he gives me a pretty good deal on the stuff. Because, young man, I'll tell you straight up, the money sure isn't flowing in like it used to. During the 50s and 60s we could have been millionaires, we were actually, but Pitchforth was always very careful with the money, putting into saving accounts and strange investment packages. Now, I'm glad he did, because it would be nearly impossible to run this place without those stashes of funds, and quite frankly, I'm starting to feel old age set in. I'm still getting a slow steady stream of people who wish to spend the next few thousand years pleasantly mummified, but you know, if I could just get the machine running, it'd make my life a lot easier. There just isn't enough time, and it's funny because that beginner's guide used to be mine. Go ahead, look on the second page there at the bottom left, see that? I did as he suggested and there it was. I read the name out loud and we both said Herbert Swanson at the same time. It was a vaguely chilling moment of synchronized speech. I was sort of waiting. Mr. Swanson went on. I was hoping that someday someone would show some interest in the subject. Someone who wasn't afraid of the implications, and, well look, let me just ask you something, young man, would like to become my apprentice?